As we roam together along this unique beach, where the waters of the Great Lakes lap at the sands of the paranormal, we would be remiss to not look down at the incredible bounty of acronyms that line the shore. We might find ourselves exploring the lakefronts of the USA by way of MI, WI, or NY, or perhaps exploring our HOMES via MN, IL, IN, OH, or PA. Maybe even gazing at the UP from across the waters in southern ON. And as we do, we're bound to find plenty of PIs hunting for EVPs. We might even find someone's PK registering on our EMF meter, but that is, of course, only if your ESP is NA and you don't pick up on them first. And just like how people in the D argue over the best Coney dogs, or the residents of T-Dot in Montreal shout about their NHL team's MVP's performance last night in OT, the high strangeness community has its own rivalries when it comes to acronyms. Namely, Unidentified Flying Object, UFO, or Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon, UAP. Which is best? Well, let's consider the trade-offs. UFO is indeed the appropriate way to note that an FO is in fact U. UFO is also interchangeable with UAP, but only if the AP happens to be F. And while the U remains the same in both, unidentified, FO is too specific. It has to fly and be an object, objectively. And AP is too broad, anomalous is ambiguous, and in terms of providing any detail, phenomenon fails. As does the rarely used USO, unidentified submerged object, at least in these cases. Could we perhaps find ourselves pioneers in both the Great Lakes and in the paranormal, on the verge of an exciting new acronym? Hello, and welcome, my freshwater friends, to episode 16 of the About the Water podcast, an exploration of high strangeness on and around the Great Lakes. Today, we set sail for Lakes M and O, where ghostly sails cut through the laws of physics, and puffing steamers defy logic, as the U truly finds its home about the water. Episode 16, Unambiguously Unidentified. Story 1, Ripwake. In the 1600s, Etienne Brulé crossed the St. Lawrence River at the eastern end of Lake Ontario and journeyed into the unknown territory which would later become Canada, carrying little more than his ambition. 200 years later, Joseph Nicolet took on the impossible task of mapping the Great Lakes in great detail, with a pen and paper as his companions. But it wasn't until 1971 that Milwaukee-born tax attorney Bob would make history by crossing the width of Lake Michigan with only a 40-foot-long Eagle trawler yacht, a single case of beer, and 7 friends. Late September on Lake Michigan can be absolute paradise. The fluffy white clouds of summer up their contrast, taking on layers of grays and blues and oranges and purples. The air is cool and crisp, and the lake is all yours. Bob met up with his friends at their shared slip on the Milwaukee River in downtown Milwaukee. After a few checks, they boarded Bob's boat, the Sturgeon, and were underway. About a mile later, the Milwaukee and Kinnickinnic rivers met, opening into the huge harbor of Milwaukee Bay. Lake Michigan was a sheet of glass, barely even a ripple. Bobby flipped his sunglasses down, fearful that one of his friends might catch the admiring tear in his eye. He loved this place. He loved this lake. And in this brief moment, it belonged to him. Bobby grabbed the throttle lever and commanded the single Cummins diesel all ahead full. The bow of the trawler rose just enough to catch a couple of his friends off guard, sending them staggering, but not quite to the floor. Bobby and his crew had charted their course, straight across Lake Michigan from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Grand Haven, Michigan, just shy of 84 miles, a trip they were hoping to make in just under 7 hours. Bob's best friend, also named Bob, was hovering over his shoulder, champing at the bit for a turn at the wheel. With a roll of his eyes, Bob handed over the helm to, also Bob. "She's all yours, BB." While in the company of their friends, also Bob went by the nickname BB, an acronym meaning Better Bob. BB took the wheel, and Bob grabbed a pair of high-powered binoculars from the storage compartment. The kid inside him still wanted to be a world explorer, and scanning the horizon here was about as close as he was ever going to get. After sweeping the horizon from the starboard side to the port side, Bobby motioned to BB to slow down. Pulling the engine back to idle, BB quickly joined Bob on the bow. "What in the world do you think that's all about?" Bob asked, handing BB the binoculars. BB took a look, and sure enough, he saw the same thing Bob did. A mile or so in front of them was a large sloop. Its single sail was violently catching huge gusts of wind, jerking it front to back and looking like it was about to rip the mast right off the boat. The boat itself was bobbing up and down, the nose repeatedly coming close to going under. On board, there appeared to be a 3 to 4 man crew, flailing around and trying desperately to tug on various lines, with little effect. "What on earth?" BB said, lowering the binoculars. They both looked around. Aside from their own wake, the water was near motionless. There was zero wind, no clouds. One could have safely roamed these waters in a kayak. Bob went back to the helm and instructed his friends to keep an eye out, as they might need to help a ship in distress. Bob returned the engine to full power and decided to set a course to intercept the sailboat. But even at full power, Bob found that the Sturgeon was unable to keep up. The speedometer read 23 knots, and the engine temperature was creeping up. So Bob idled the engine again and grabbed the binoculars. BB and the other men were squinting to see the boat with the naked eye. They watched in disbelief as the sloop began to vanish out of sight. "This makes 0 sense," Bob said. "Even under power, that thing could do what, like 10 knots tops?" BB replied. Maybe 15, maybe." "It's got to be doing 50, Bob said. "We should radio the, Before Bob could finish the words Coast Guard, the trawler began to rock heavily, hard enough that BB and a couple of the other guys nearly went overboard. Bob scrambled back inside, grabbing the wheel and trying to assess what in the world had just happened. Rain was pouring down on the vessel. The bright outside skies had instantly turned dark, so dark under the cloud cover that Bobby had to turn all the interior lights on. Huge waves grabbed at the boat like angry hands, wanting nothing more than to pull it underwater. As the men scrambled inside, BB tried to shut the cabin door against a large wave that was now crashing through it. Bob counted his friends, frantically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and me. "Yeah, I'm here. Go, go, go." The engine groaned as Bob tried to free the ship out of the troughs of the waves. "Heading 270, 270, Bobby, 270, BB was shouting. Bob nodded. He leaned hard against the wheel, begging the ship to make the turn. And it was in that moment he realized he didn't have enough power. The wind was tearing at the Sturgeon, rattling her windows and blowing loose items overboard. Bob staggered his way over to the marine radio to call out for a mayday. In an instant, the boat leveled out. The skies were bright, and the water was instantly calm. The Sturgeon now began making its way effortlessly across the motionless water back towards Milwaukee. The 8 men stood, totally silent. all of them soaking wet from the rain and the waves that had attacked them just seconds ago. One by one, they each realized the impossibility of the experience. They stepped back outside onto the deck, looking in all directions at the cloudless, windless sky and the tranquil waters. The friends returned to Milwaukee under full throttle, Bob's hands shaking as he death-gripped the wheel. We should, I guess, radio the Coast Guard, BB suggested. Bob slammed the throttle back into idle, grabbing BB by his wet shirt and pointing to the pristine weather that extended 80 miles out across the lake. And tell them what? For weeks after, Bob kept an eye on the newspapers for any missing sailboats, thankfully never finding anything printed. He did also finally phone the Coast Guard, who found his story less than amusing. Bob would regularly tell himself that he should write the newspapers about the strange experience, whereupon he would just laugh. Yeah, and tell them what? Story 2. Raise Anchor. Lake Ontario is the freshest Great Lake, Jen explained to the group. Think of it as freshly stirred by Niagara Falls. Aerated, you know. Jen didn't know if that was true, but it made sense. In the circle of bobbing kayaks, containing tourists from all corners of Canada and the U.S. and beyond, well, they seemed amused, so she continued the tour. The group had launched from a small public beach adjacent to Ryerson Park in the Ontario town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. Jen advertised her tours as historic nearshore paddles out to the U.S.-Canada border for a history lesson on Fort George on the Canadian side and Fort Niagara on the American side. Inevitably, however, these tours routinely amounted to little more than Jen acting as a babysitter, while clueless paddlers found new and creative ways to unintentionally capsize their vessels. Is that Toronto? That's the big tower there, right? A young man asked, pointing off into the distance. Yes, indeed, the CN Tower, Jen replied. She explained that construction had recently been completed, and it would be opening next year, in the summer of 1976. Before she could continue with a brief explanation of the visible landmarks of the Toronto skyline, she was interrupted by a scream from the back of the group. One of the paddlers was looking over their shoulder in terror, desperately trying to paddle away from something. "Shark!" he screamed. "No, there's no sharks in the Great Lakes," Jen began to explain, before she saw it too. It wasn't a shark. It was several. Huge dorsal fins, one by one poking out of the water, only to sink again. She ordered the group to paddle towards her, and with varying degrees of success they did. Jen watched as the fins started to circle past them slowly, when suddenly she realized they weren't fins. They were the tips of blades, propeller blades, 2 sets of them. Taking in her surroundings, Jen then noticed a large, well-worn red steel bulge protruding from the water about 50 feet past the propellers. The group just stared, each of them posing their own statement of confused disbelief using varying dialects and regional appropriate profanity. The propellers were beginning to slow, and within seconds they had stopped entirely. With a loud plastic thud, a member of the group in a tandem kayak flipped over backwards and into the water. The front of the kayak had been hit by something, pulled directly out of the water, and straight upwards for a moment, before stopping and falling. The tourists panicked. One by one, almost all of the kayaks had capsized. "Everybody, it's fine. We're only a few hundred feet from shore. Just swim that direction, and please don't grab other people's kayaks, okay? You'll flip them over, too." Jen trailed off as she looked over her shoulder. She saw the object that had flipped over the tandem kayak, an object that she can't get out of her mind to this day. It was an anchor. a large boat anchor. It rose out of the water and straight into the sky, pulling a taut chain behind it, and then just abruptly stopped. A desperate hand grabbed the side of Jen's kayak, and over the side she went. She helped assist an hysterical tourist back to shore, counting everyone to make sure they were present. Gasping for breath and on all fours, Jen turned around towards the water, and what she saw from there would leave her baffled. She saw nothing. Aside from the leftover ripples that were churned up when the group made its way to shore, the water was calm. Abandoning their life jackets and shouting more obscenities at Jen, the majority of the group simply disbanded. Jen sat on the beach, trying to make sense out of what she just experienced, just watching as 7 of her 10 kayaks floated out towards the lake. Just as she gained enough composure and courage to grab a paddle and start to head out towards the water to collect her livelihood, she was stopped by a familiar voice. The same young man who had inquired about the Toronto skyline now stood behind her, breathing heavily, on the verge of panic. That was an anchor, right? You saw it, right? He asked. Jen laid back on the beach and covered her face with her hands, knowing well in that moment that was the last time she would see those kayaks again, let alone venture out in one. All she could do was lay there in confusion and mumble through her hands. No refunds. Better Bob, or BB, and I met a few years ago. We struck up a conversation as we stood on deck, crossing Lake Michigan via Milwaukee's high-speed Lake Express ferry. I commented on how choppy the waters seemed, and with a hearty laugh, he just replied, "I've seen worse." So of course I asked for an explanation, and he told me he and Bob's story. I tried locating him prior to this story to go over a couple additional details, but I was never able to find him. So the entire account you just heard was based off a voice recording I took a few years ago. That's all the details I have. Jen's daughter, Emma, shared her story recently via video call from the observation deck of the CN Tower. She just, in her own words, thought that it would be cool to see the story from the other side of Lake Ontario, which it was. It really, really was. And, as tends to be the unintended tradition on this show, neither one of them have any explanation as to what they saw aside from the details that we just recounted. So frustratingly, let's make our way past those acronyms WTF and BS and try to make sense out of all this. I'm curious as to whether you came up with the same conclusions I did, that Bobby's experience involved his trawler crossing some kind of metaphysical barrier. He observed the distressed sloop from his side, crossing that boundary just briefly enough to send him dashing back home to his side. Jen's experience doesn't sound much different, with the exception that her barrier was simply not on the XY axis, but rather the Z axis, so to speak. Perhaps she was seeing the bottom of a completely normal steamer, just from a very unique vantage point. The anchor didn't float, it just sank up. Makes sense, right? At least around here it does. And these are far from the only paranormal ship experiences in our About the Water treasure chest. There's enough of these first-hand encounters here to keep us here all day, which I would love to do. However, we have business regarding our acronyms. A lot of paranormal folks would use USO, but that S gets in the way. These objects weren't submerged. I guess arguably Jen's steamer, but maybe Jen was the one who was submerged. So let's revisit UFO or UAP. In either case, unidentified definitely applies. 2 vessels, neither one having an observed name, and from what I could find, neither one of them having any kind of legend or lore associated with them, especially in those specific locations. So fair enough, the U stays. F is out, so is A. They weren't flying, and they weren't exactly anomalous. Both were unmistakably boats. Both were interacting with the water to some degree. O and P are also out. Object is just too vague. We know they're boats. Phenomenon could, I guess maybe, be more accurate, since the blatant violations of the laws of physics do exist in both stories. Instead, may I suggest a new acronym, one that we will undoubtedly use around here a lot. Unidentified, unknown, hydrological, maritime, mystery, hereby known as an... Sorry, it's late. I thought that was funny. With that, thank you, sincerely, and as always, for listening. May your sails be steady, may your vessel always be upright, and may your journeys into the unknown be as grand, beautiful, and enduring as our Great Lakes. I'll see you about the water.